So howdy folks, and welcome to the 5th episode of the Wild World of Bees. My name is Lincoln Best, and I'm the taxonomist for the Oregon Bee Atlas, and I'll be your host for this evening's Wild World of Bees. This is an online lecture series you can enjoy from home to learn more about the incredible diversity and lives of wild bees. Through this series, we'll hear from great bee researchers and advocates from around the world, and often with a focus closer to us here in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. This series is brought to you by the Oregon Bee Atlas, an initiative to document the bee fauna of Oregon. The Oregon Bee Atlas is the biodiversity-focused arm of the Oregon Bee Project, a partnership between OSU Extension, the Oregon Department of Forestry, and the Oregon Department of Agriculture. The series is also sponsored by the Mount Pisgah Arboretum in Eugene, Oregon, a great place to observe flowering plants and the Arboretum's local bee fauna. In June, I had the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Dr. Jim Rivers. He's the PI of the Forest Animal Ecology Lab here at OSU. Jim spoke with us about their work examining drivers of pollinator diversity and abundance in Oregon forest systems. And for those of you who missed it, you can find his talk posted on the Oregon Bee Atlas YouTube channel. Please remember to subscribe, like, share, and hit that notification bell. Now, next month, we'll be hearing from Scott Mitchell and Dr. Sandra DeBano of the Hermiston Agricultural Research and Extension Center. They'll be talking about their ongoing native bee research in the biodiverse ecosystems of the Starkey Experimental Forest and Range and the Zumwalt Prairie. Make sure to put it in your calendar and register. Now, this evening, I'm very happy to introduce my friend, intrepid scientist, educator, and all-round bee champion, Olivia Messinger Carril. Olivia is an author of the amazing book, The Bees in Your Backyard. This is the comprehensive introductory reference manual to the diversity, natural history, ecology, and identification of bees in North America, and it has thousands of beautiful photographs. For anyone interested in learning more about native bees, this is the place to start. I have a shelf devoted to this book, and I don't mean one copy and a little shrine. Now, please feel free to use the chat function during the lecture to communicate with other viewers, and use the Q&A function to enter your questions for Olivia. And we will do our best to finish up around 8 p.m. So, do we have Olivia?
You have me.
Hooray! So, if you want to fire up your presentation, I'll pass it over to you.
So here's the weird thing. My computer suddenly doesn't have a camera. It says that the camera's gone. So I'm here. I will happily talk. You just won't get to see me. So I'm going to talk tonight about desert bees. This is kind of where I am, and it's the fauna with which I am most familiar. It may be my favorite thing to think about and study most of the time. Don't tell my kids I said that. But I wanted to start by highlighting how amazing bees are in general, and then we'll get to some more specific examples of really amazing bees. So I want to start, imagine you're going car shopping and all of the options that you have on your car. Well, bees come with options too. First of all, almost all of them have eyes that wrap around the sides of their heads, these wonderful compound eyes that can see in 270 degrees. And they have built-in UV capability, which means that while we see red through purple colors, bees can see the same range of colors, but it's shifted down a little bit. So they see kind of orange, but they see well into the UV range, which is kind of amazing for them because when they look at a beautiful flower, something like this, they see this instead. So the flower stands out in a much different way from how it does to us, which is kind of amazing. Here's another example. These are from Bjorn, see his name down there, Bjorn Roslet's website. It's old and outdated at this point. I don't think he keeps up on it much anymore, but if you want to see cool pictures of UV flowers, he has a whole subsection donated to them. That's kind of amazing. Here's another, a beautiful little potentilla. This is what the bee would see looking at that same flower. In addition to those amazing eyes on the front, they also have 3 more eyes on the top of their head, which act as a navigation system. Comes standard on most models. Sometimes those eyes are extra big, sometimes they're a little smaller, depending on if the bee flies more in the evening and dusk hours or like early morning, or whether it flies in the middle of the day. They can see light and dark, they can orient with the sun using those 3 eyes. They also have this extended floral scent detector, sometimes we call it an antenna. The males even come fully equipped with a female detector as well. They have an extra antennal segment. Almost all bee genera have this in the males, and we think it might allow them to smell, in addition to flowers, also where females are. And they can even smell them in the ground when they're in their nest and dig down to where they are, which is kind of awesome. They have built-in reusable grocery bags. This one has the grocery bags here on the underside of the abdomen. A lot of them have them on their legs instead. And this is where they pack all of the pollen that they collect on different flowers and bring it home and deposit it in their pantry, their storage structures back home. They have face scissors. Seems very handy to me. It's like the bee version of Edward Scissorhands. And they can use these to cut little pieces off of leaves. They can gather pebbles with their face scissors, their mandibles, if you will. They can pick up small rocks. They can pick up bits of cottony material off of plants. They can fight with other insects. Those face scissors come in pretty handy. And then they have wings, pretty amazing wings that allow them both to fly really fast, forward, backwards, up, down, sideways, away from my net as often as possible. They have a fail-safe self-defense stinger. Only the females have this on the very back end. Females are the only ones that have this sting because the sting is a modified ovipositor that used to be where the eggs came out. Now they've kind of separated and there's 2 things that have 2 different functions, but the sting remains and acts as a means of defense. And it works quite well, I can tell you from experience. Then they have multifunctioning mouth parts, and different groups of bees have very different mouth parts. It's sometimes the most distinctive thing about a family of bees is what all they have there. And it can act as a paintbrush and paint on the insides of the nest. It can act as a straw to suck up nectar. There's some thought that it can taste in some sense, or at least determine the quality of nectar. And they can use it to sort of sponge and dab at things as well. And then they have this all-in-one leg device. They can walk, they can climb. Some of them climb better than others, depending on whether they have that little aurelia in the middle of the claws. They can sense electromagnetic forces, and they can clean their antenna, all with the same leg structure. It comes with built-in knee pads, but some of them also have extra little bits and pieces that allow them to land and float on top of water the same way that water striders do. So there you go, a pretty amazing creature, all right here, all in one. And there's a lot of different kinds. They come in all models, shapes, sizes, colors. You pick it. You could probably get a model in that color. We think there's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 species of these guys around the world. Here in the US, somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000. And in the Southwest, which I'll focus on this evening, there are thousands. They say that maybe 1 in every 4 bee species that occurs in the US can be found in the Southwest, which is a big, vague region, but we'll get to that here in a second. So we know that east of the Mississippi River, if you look at historical data and documents, you find that there are about 770 bee species, which, just to kind of put that in perspective, there are around 1,100 birds across all of North America. So just in the eastern US, there are about as many bees as there are birds across the whole US. If you want to break it down by state, and this isn't all of the states, but it's enough to kind of give you the sense that as you move from the north, from the northern border here, Montana, Nebraska, Minnesota, etc., down south, you can see that bee species richness across the US increases. And you can see the same trend as you move from east to west, so that by the time you get down to that southwest corner where all those hot deserts are, there are a lot of different bees. Joe Wilson made these cool maps, and let me share them with you tonight. And they are color-coded by ecoregions. So ecoregions are things like the Chihuahuan Desert, the Mojave Desert, Sonoran Desert, Great Basin, Colorado Plateau, etc., etc. Short grass prairie, tall grass prairie, eastern deciduous forest, and on and on. And the darker the color, the more genera, so bee genus, plural is genera, the more genera there are. And you can see that the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts have the most genera according to published records for bee species from all of the major collections. The most genera are found in those two desert regions. But when you look at species, the number of species, that kind of shifts a little bit. At the species level, the greatest diversity occurs in the Great Basin and Colorado plateaus, which is kind of interesting. So even though there are fewer genera within each of those different groups like Perdita or Osmia or Melisodes, whatever group you pick, there are a lot more species occurring in those two regions. All of which is to say that no matter how you cut the cake, the desert Southwest is a great place to be looking for bees. And I'm lucky enough to live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there's a lot for me to do here. You guys remember, I don't know, this is my childhood, so maybe this dates me a little bit, but I used to love this show, Sesame Street, when I was little. I'd watch it, and one of my favorite things was the part where they played the little song about one of these things is not like the others. I like this analogy because I think it's a great way to talk about bees. One of these bees, believe it or not, is not like the others. And you could pull out any one of those and say, well, yeah, it's not like the others. And technically you're right, they're all pretty different. But there's one that stands out even more as being pretty different from all of the other bees that we find around North America, and it is the honeybee. The honeybee was brought over twice, we think, once by way of Northern Europe and once with Spanish colonization up through Mexico and into the Southwest. But the honeybee arrived in North America, we think 400 or so years ago. And it is semi-domesticated. We can't really call it completely domesticated, but it's closer than any of these other bees, that's for sure. And it's highly managed and more equivalent to maybe a cow than a wild bison, if you were to think of ungulates or something like that. It stands out because it lives in hives. The hive includes members who divide up the tasks. There's very clear division of labor with a queen that stays home and lays eggs, and that's all she does, and then a lot of workers that do various tasks throughout their lifetime, including taking care of the queen, taking care of the offspring, etc., etc. And they all live in a hive together with maybe up to 30,000 individuals all in one little hive. This is pretty different from your standard solitary bee. So most of the bees in North America are solitary, meaning that each female builds her own nest, gathers pollen for that nest, and then lays the eggs that will go with the pollen that she's put into that nest. And they each do it more or less by themselves. They may do it in small communities, so they, are closely grouped together, but it's never a hive. And more importantly, there's no honey associated with any of these. When I talk about the life cycle, that'll probably become clear. So let's talk about some of the ways that I think are really important by which the honeybee differs from all of these other bees. And as I do, I'm going to highlight some of the really cool bees that we can find in the desert Southwest. So the first thing that it might be important to recognize is that bees come in a lot of different sizes. A lot of people think of a honeybee and they assume that is the size of all the bees. But in fact, a honeybee is, maybe half the size of this black carpenter bee, this Xylocopa, that's sitting on a corner here. And next to it is what we call a small mining or a fairy bee. And it's the genus is Perdita. And they're really, really common in the desert Southwest. I think there's something like 600 species across the US, and most of them are found in the Southwest. That's not even very small for Perdita. So here's that same quarter. This is the smallest bee in North America, and it occurs mostly in the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts. It's a very hot desert species. And it's tiny. It's so tiny. And it's a specialist on a plant in the Euphorbiaceae, the leafy spurge family. So here it is really up close. Jillian Cowles is the wonderful woman who took this photo. And she said it was 110 degrees and she was laying on her belly in the sand while taking this amazing picture and almost overheated, just trying to catch a picture of this bee in its desert environment. So that's a pretty neat one, and definitely way smaller than your average honeybee. Most of these bees nest in the ground. So while the honeybee, of course, is the bee that you find nesting in the hives, it's pretty unique for that reason. Most bees, about 70% of them, and a higher proportion in the Southwest than you would find in like eastern deciduous forests actually nest in hard packed earth or, sandy areas or maybe lawns or something like that. There's a variety of different places that you might find them, but you can always call it earth. It's the ground. You can watch, this is a diadasia, one of my favorites, a little cactus bee in this case. Nope, this one's, this is a mallow bee, but same group, diadasia. And she is building her nest, and as she kind of pushes at the earth, you can see she's using her mandibles there to chew at the earth where it's a little bit harder and soften it up. And then she's taking her front legs and pushing on the ground to push that earth and kind of pack it in really tightly. And I should point out that this is in the middle of a dirt road. She gets driven over. I watched this little nest get driven over a couple times. It didn't seem to faze her one bit, and she kept going. She was in a colony, and that colony had been in this area for several years, not seeming to care at all that they were in the middle of a road. Other places in the ground that you might find bee nests are cracks, just simple cracks in clay, or sort of silty areas where they can push the soil away a little bit and then push themselves into it. Some of them will have a mound and look a little bit like a gopher mound around it. And some of them, like other species of diadasia, will have these little chimneys over them. If you were to look inside the ground at one of these nests, and you would do that by blowing some chalk dust down into one of those holes. You can see on the left there, those white holes, that's where chalk dust was blown in. And then you can take a trowel and kind of dig down beside them, and you find that main tunnel headed down, and at the bottom of the tunnel, I'm looking on the right side now, there will be a series of little chambers, and each one of those chambers ends in a little tiny bee nest, and each of those bee nests will end up with a ball of pollen in it, and then on the top of that she will set an egg, and then she'll backfill this tunnel a little bit and go off and dig another off of the same main nest entrance. So that main tunnel will have several little nurseries, each with its own bee in there. Usually these are quite shallow, maybe 6 inches to 1.5 feet under the ground. But on occasion, as in the case of the bee Andrena hainesi, which is a specialist on sunflowers and found in the San Rafael Swell, which is in south central Utah, they can get quite deep. I reread this paper today just to make sure I had all the facts right, but Terry Griswold and Frank Parker were out looking for bee nests, and they found a small colony of what they knew to be Andrena hainesi. And so they thought they'd dig it up because nobody had ever looked at this particular Andrena before. And they found the bottom of this nest 2.7 meters underground, which by my calculations is a little over 8.1 feet. And then there was an additional sort of shallow shaft going off of that as well. So almost 9 feet, the way Terry puts it, off of this main little opening here at the top. They found the bottom of the nest. It was so exhausting, as they put in the paper, it took them 7 hours, that they decided not to dig up anymore. One was good enough, and they published that. But so some nests can be very deep in the case of this bee, and their thought is that because the bee is nesting at the edge of a sand dune, that perhaps because the surface sand tends to shift and the nest entrance can be lost, maybe the bee digs so deep in order to prevent the eggs in the nest from being blown away when the top little layer of sand is blown and shifts around, which is one possibility. Either way, chances are good that the perfect nesting resource is hard to come by, and probably successive generations of bees are reusing the same nest entrance as well. Those bees that don't nest in the ground often nest in wood. Here's a little leafcutter bee. She's got a rolled up piece of leaf underneath her here that she's taking back to one of these holes, and she'll take it in and use it as sort of like a wallpaper, and make a little envelope inside there that she puts a bunch of pollen in. As an example, here's one. This is an osmia. This is a mason bee, and she's actually chewed up the leaf and made little wallpaper or little divisions between the nest cells using chewed up pieces of leaf rather than the whole leaf. So if you watch that again, you can see she's got a full belly of pollen here. And when she's done kind of prepping the nest a little bit, she does the Michael Phelps flip and then unpacks all of that pollen into this. And what's really cool is if you look at this, you can tell that these bees were laid in order. This one on the right in the back there was, of course, the first one laid. And then the next one was a little further to the left and more to the left and more to the left. And the one she's working on now will be the youngest bee. The strange thing about that is, of course, it means that the bee that was laid first will be developed first and should technically chew through all of its offspring on the way out. And in fact, that does happen sometimes with some bees. But one of the things that females can do is pick the sex of their offspring at the time that they lay their eggs. And so quite often, what she'll do is lay mostly female eggs at the back of the nest. Female eggs are the result of fertilization. So when she's mated, she stores the sperm inside a special organ in her body. And at the time that she lays an egg, she can decide if she's going to fertilize it or not. If she fertilizes it, it becomes a female, and the females take longer to develop. So she'll put those at the back of the nest, and then near the front of the nest, near the opening, she'll lay male eggs, which are unfertilized, no sperm involved in them. And those will be the males, and they'll develop. Hopefully everyone will be ready to come out at about the same time. So here, back to that envelope, here's what the little leaf envelopes, if they don't chew them up, would look like. You can see each of these. And if you were to look closely at one, it might look something like that picture in the middle, the green little bullet looking thing there. Other things that you might find inside a bee nest are little bits of petals. Sometimes they'll use pieces of flower petals. Down here where I am, we often see bees using Oenothera, evening primrose leaves, and using those to line the insides of their nests. Some bees will nest in snail shells. This is a lovely example here. Some bees line the insides of their nest with a cellophane-like material. This is what we call the cellophane bee, and they actually excrete a material that dries into something very similar to sort of like a plasticky material, and it's waterproof. And the provision inside there tends to include more nectar than some of the others, which are more pollen. And then down on the bottom right, I don't know if you can just make out, there's a little bee abdomen coming out of the inside of a cactus. This is a Cholla cactus, and the bee's nesting inside. So you could call that a stem nester of sorts, right? I think that's still the stem of a cactus. This is another one we find in the desert Southwest, and it's pretty rare in that it nests in sandstone. They actually take their mandibles. You usually find Anthophora pueblo near a little source of water, because they'll bring back some water and put it on the sandstone to soften it a little bit, and then they'll chew and chew and chew at the sandstone until they've softened it enough to make a hole that they nest in. Here's another thing that you might find inside a bee nest is a little bit of cotton. Here's an Anthidium, a wool carder bee, and she is pulling off some of the fuzz that you find there. You can see it in her mouth. She pulls off some of the fuzz from the flowers and then balls it up underneath her and carries it back to pad the nest cells and provide those walls in between the different cells. So one more time, watch for that right there. You can see in her mandibles carrying that fuzz away. So here, I was afraid that wasn't very clear, so I put one more in just to make it clear. You can see right underneath her, she's holding it with her mandibles and her front legs. There's a little bit of fuzz, and that comes from a plant. She's carted it off of a plant. Male bees don't have nests, so sometimes you find them at night all huddled together. They may fight for females during the day, but at night they seem to make a truce and come together. I'm cheating a little bit here. I took this in Ohio, which is hardly the desert Southwest. I just haven't been able to film it here, but the same thing happens here with the same genus of bees, the Melisodes. And yeah, the males will all group together and hang on with their mandibles to a leaf or to a piece of stem and tuck their legs up underneath them, and that's where they spend the night. Some of them, and this is from the desert Southwest, this is from my backyard, will nest inside flowers that are closed for the night, kind of a safe little place to be, and super fun to find. If you can find one of those bees nesting in there, it's pretty great. Okay, so let's talk through what the life cycle for one of these is like, because it's a bit different from the honeybee. Honeybee colonies are perennial, and a queen can live for like 5 to 7 years. That's not the case at all for these guys. So in the early spring, and I could have put, I mean, technically this could say summer, it could say early fall. Bees come out, there are bees for every season. There is a seasonality to bees, just as there's a seasonality to fruits, right? Like cherries come out earlier and apples are later and peaches are somewhere in between and watermelons are right now. But so in the same way that there's a seasonality to fruits and flowers, there's a seasonality to bee. So let's assume this bee, the season is early spring. The bees emerge, usually the males come out first. That's because they don't take as long to develop, and they immediately start looking for a female. And if they can find her, they'll mate with her almost right away. Some bees mate more than one time and store several batches of sperm in their spermatheca, the organ on their body. Other bees only mate the one time. It just depends on the species. So the females forage, they build nests, they determine where they're going to live, and then they immediately start laying eggs with the provisions that they've put into those nests. But by summer, about 6 to 9 weeks after those female bees have emerged, they're actually dead. That adult life cycle part is kind of the end. That is the tail end of their life. She never meets her offspring. The eggs actually eclose or hatch or come out, whatever you want to say, after the nest has been sealed, and she doesn't even see that part happen. So the adults die, but the larvae continue to develop in their nests, whether it's in the ground or in a piece of wood or cactus or snail shell or whatever it is. And then the bees overwinter as almost adults, eating the pollen that their mother has left for them. Some of them even spin cocoons the same way a butterfly does and go through sort of a metamorphosis in there. And then by the next spring, a year later, after the last adult emerge, they emerge again and start the cycle all over again. And there's lots of variations on this, and I'll talk through one specific one that happens here in the desert Southwest in a moment. But before I do, let me really quick walk you through bumblebees, which are also quite common in the Southwest, believe it or not. And they're just a little bit different from your typical sort of solitary bee. So when you see bumblebees in the spring, the first thing that you're seeing is usually a queen bumblebee, and they're very large. They're like the size of your thumb, these really big bees. And they emerge and they're mated. They were actually mated the previous fall and spent all winter in sort of a hibernation. So that mated queen emerges, she forages, and she begins building a nest. And the nest for bumblebees, at least where I am, is usually like a grass tussock or an old rodent burrow or underneath a flower pot that's been left alone for some time or something like that. She'll bring in some grass to pad it if she needs to, but hopefully she can find something that already has some padding. And that queen will produce a series of daughters. That first generation, that first brood of daughters is usually quite small because they develop very quickly. She vibrates her body to keep them warm and keep them active and keep them developing. And as soon as those small daughters have emerged, she stays home and continues to lay more eggs and grow the colony. So that by the end of the summer, the worker bees are allowed to slow down in their growth, and they actually come out a little bit bigger. So over the course of the season, you usually see really big queens early on. Then you see these slightly small, well, much smaller daughters. And then by midsummer, the bumblebees seem to be getting bigger in size again. And it can become hard to tell queens from worker bees because they're almost the same in size. And in fact, some of those may even be queens that will fly off and be mated by males from other nests and hibernate over winter and start the cycle over again the next year. So those are the two sort of main life cycles. There's several variations. If I go back here, one of the interesting ones on your typical solitary bee sort of life cycle is that some bees will actually emerge and have sort of a normal early spring through summer development. But then another generation will very quickly develop and come out and have a really quick sort of fall season and then over winter. And we call those bivoltine because they come out twice in 1 year. So this is the other thing though, and this is my favorite. So this is a strategy called bet-hedging, and it happens mostly in the Southwest where rainfall can be kind of sporadic. Some years rainfall is great, some years maybe not so much. This year we thought we were going to have a really good monsoon season. It's failed to materialize. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm kind of in the same boat as a lot of bees too. So the eggs that are in the ground right now for a lot of these bees were actually laid last year, and the mother had no idea whether there was going to be adequate flowering this year, which is interesting because it's kind of similar to flowers that set seed last year. All of those seeds that have been lying in the earth waiting for the next flowering season really don't know whether rainfall is going to be adequate to make going through the trouble of making the next generation worth it. So bees and annual flowers do something similar, and in bees we call it bet-hedging. And this is where a certain percentage of the bees each year sort of hedge their bets or make the bet, the call that perhaps the following year will be better for flowers, and it would make more sense to wait in the ground for an additional season and come out maybe 2 years after the egg was laid. The bees most likely to do this are the ones with bigger provisions. If the mother provided them with more resources, they're probably able to survive for one more year that way. And the same is true for flowers. The seeds that have a little more food, if you will, inside the embryo there are more likely to wait and germinate in a year when rainfall is better. So one of the best studied bees for this is one that is found kind of on the border between New Mexico and Arizona, right above Mexico, so way far south. And it's called Macrodora portalis, named after the town of Portal, Arizona that's down there. And this bee, maybe some of you know who he is. His name's Brian Danforth, and he studied this bee for his PhD. And one of the things that he found is that if you induce rain, if you make the ground wet, the bees will emerge. So they seem to be able to time their emergence with rainfall events, and if no rainfall events happen, they can wait in the ground, which is kind of fascinating to me. Many of these bees are specialists, meaning that even if there's all sorts of different flowers in bloom and many options to pick from, they limit themselves to some subset of what is available when gathering pollen to take back to the nest for their offspring. Here's a great example that's really common in the desert Southwest. This is a male, so it's not actually collecting pollen, but nonetheless, it's a pretty great little bee, and a good majority of the ones in this genus are specialists on plants in the sunflower family. So usually when they specialize at the level of a floral genus or a floral family. And I don't know if any of you have ever wondered what those long antennae are for. I wondered for years, and only last year managed to figure out. Let me see if I can get this to play. My internet is a little tricky tonight, as you might have figured out by now. So there's a male mating with a female, and you can actually see how he uses his antenna. Kind of awesome. So there it is, mystery solved. Many of these guys are specialists, but again, like I said, they specialize usually at the level of the plant family, so they'll visit anything within the Asteraceae, whether it's helianthus, or sunflowers, or something else totally different. Let's see if I can get this to go here. There it goes. Okay. So oftentimes when I talk about specialization, one of the questions that comes up is whether this means that there is a one-to-one relationship with a bee for every plant and a plant for every bee, and it's this beautiful one-to-one relationship. In fact, a couple of these are one-to-one relationships. Here's a good example. This bee is called Andrena astragali, and it visits only a plant called Zygodinus. Zygodinus is the death camas, and it's actually poisonous or toxic to, the nectar on this is toxic to most bees, and even cattle can't really eat this thing. Death camas isn't good for a lot of different things, but here's this bee, Andrena astragali, that collects pollen from it. So there are instances where the relationship is one-to-one. Here's another interesting sort of one-to-one relationship. This bee is called centris. It's really common in the desert Southwest. I think there's, a little less than a dozen species. And they all have these amazing eyes, bright red or bright green. And many of them they look like chaps, just these giant hairs for collecting pollen on the back legs. And a couple of the centris are specialists on creosote, which is Larrea tridentata. And this is kind of a funny story, just because Larrea tridentata is actually the only species in the genus. So by default, this is a bee that is a specialist on one species. Clearly that's not, it's a pretty widespread and really common plant, but nonetheless, it does occur. What's interesting about these is that some of the species are actually specialists on plants in the Malpighiaceae. Cremeria is one of the plants in there, and they grab, the centris will land on this beautiful little plant. It'll grab onto the anthers here with its mandibles, and then it will scrape the underside of these petals. I don't know if you can see, they're kind of roughened. And as it scrapes it, floral oil oozes out of some hairs that are underneath it. And the centris, it's called, some people call it the oil digging bee or digging oil bee, something like that. And it'll scrape off those floral oils and collect them and take them back to the nest as an additional source of nutrients for its offspring. So that's kind of cool. Other bees are way more generalists and will visit just about anything. But across the board, all of that leads to some pretty interesting relationships when you look at the ecosystem as a whole. So here I put pictures of a couple of the flowering plants that we typically see in the Southwest. These are all things that bloom sort of late June, mid-June around here. And here are some bees that I see quite commonly that are associated with these. So osmia, let's start, sorry, I forgot to start at the side, haha. Melisodes, as I said before, is usually associated with things in the Asteraceae, which can include both of these two plants. The osmia is a specialist on penstemon, and that's all it visits. Bumblebees, because they have such a long flying season with workers out all the time, can't afford to actually specialize because no flower is around for that long. So we usually see them visiting just about anything they can find. And the same is true for agapostemon, green metallic sweat bees, which is here. So now, through the relationships of the bees with their flowers, we can see that everything, in essence, is kind of connected to each other. All of the bees and all of the plants are connected to each other through their connections with the thing on the opposite side. And this can create some really interesting dynamics if, for example, you were to remove one of the plants. Maybe habitat fragmentation makes that particular plant too hard for a bee to get to. Now all of those relationships have to be redistributed. In the case of the osmia, it can't redistribute. It needs penstemon, or it can't collect pollen for its offspring, in which case it would be gone. Meanwhile, we've increased competition on some of the other plants because overall there are less floral resources than there used to be, and now we probably have more competition on what is available. So let's reset that. Another interesting thing that can happen is when we add an invasive species into it. So here we're going to shove one more species in there. And one of the things that makes invasive species invasive and really common and popular is that they set a lot of seeds because they get a lot of pollinators. They taste good, the nectar's great, they're close enough to what's already there for whatever reason. A lot of bees will switch visitation and create, now you can see this osmia is no longer really connected to anything else. We've created a bit of a disconnect in this floral network that was once completely connected. And we have now no visitors coming to the mint that I drew here. And obviously this is all hypothetical, but I just wanted to give you the sense of how pollinator networks, especially in areas like the desert Southwest where floral resources tend to be scarce, can be really impacted by either the addition of an invasive or the removal of something for whatever reason. So just to celebrate bees, because I love this video, maybe some of you have seen it before. This is a Peponapus. It's a squash bee, and it's in a squash flower really early in the morning. And she's got pollen that she's moving from her antenna and her eyeballs and her mouth parts onto her forelegs, really cleaning herself well. That's that antennal, the leg structure I talked about earlier. And she moves it from her forelegs to her midlegs, and then from her midlegs, she'll shove it into the scopal hairs that are on her hind legs there, and then go back in, see if she can find some more. That's a male. I can tell by his long antenna. He has a little yellow on his face that you can see too. But she is clearly mated and not interested. So there it is, in a day in the life of a bee. For you all to see. So when I started collecting bees a good long time ago, I was often asked to talk about all of the times that I had been stung. People were really, that was the most exciting part, and the thing people most wanted to talk about was bee stings. And I don't really get asked that question anymore. These days, most people ask me if the bees are going to be okay. And it's a hard question to answer. You can see why. We have bees that come out in the spring, the summer, and the fall. We have bees nesting in the ground and in twigs. We have bees that are generalists and specialists. We have tiny bees that can't fly very far and big ones that can go a long ways. All of which is to say that it's really hard to come up with one answer for how bees are doing, considering all of the variations in their life histories. Nonetheless, I try. I spend my summers out a lot. I've already camped this year, goodness, what am I at? Something like 26 days. Looking for bees in various places throughout New Mexico. I use net collecting, and I use these little pan traps, maybe some of you know about these, to get a sense for what bees are in different habitats, different areas of the state, places that have never been collected. And I bring them all back and pin them all up, and then put little labels on them all so that I can sort them and identify them and try and figure out what species are occurring where, at what time of year, and in what numbers. And I had to throw this in. This is TDA Cockerell, Theodore Drew Allison Cockerell, is maybe one of my bee heroes. And in 1906, he wrote a paper called The Bees of New Mexico. So 114 years ago, he was doing what I'm doing now. And he had on the front page of that article that he wrote, that journal article, he wrote, "There's no doubt that bees, from the number of species, the ease with which they're collected, and the restricted distribution of many, afford excellent material for defining zoological regions and life zones. That they have not been used to any extent for such purposes must be explained by the inadequacy of existing collections and records, and especially the difficulty of determining species." And Link, I thought you might get a kick out of that, especially considering what you spend so much time doing. And I just have to say to this, ditto. 114 years later, we struggle with the same problems. We still don't know very much about the bees, especially in the Southwest, areas where place names, are pretty young and roads are still being developed, and it's hard to access, let alone collect bees in many of these areas. So my research seeks to quantify bee populations. That's kind of what I do all summer long. And here's my reasoning. So let's take a bee. I picked up this picture just because I thought it was gorgeous, but I could do this with anyone. And let's say that I'm in some area, and let's say I'm totally making this up, but that I collected 58 individuals in one area in 2020. The problem is that we don't know if that's a good number or a bad number. How many do we catch in 2010? Since we didn't collect there, we don't really know if there were less in that year and the population is increasing, if there were more in that year and the population's decreasing, or if they're kind of staying the same and pretty similar from year to year. And this makes it really difficult to come to conclusions about how to prioritize bees and which ones most need our help if we're unable to quantify them in any meaningful way. So these are areas where I've worked in the past. We've set up in these areas some standardized plots that were collected in a way that means we can go back 10, 20 years later and resample those same areas and learn new things. I'm now working a lot in New Mexico. These are all of the different places that I have projects going on. And you'll see there's one in southern Utah, and I'm resampling a place that I collected from 2000 to 2003. So from 2000 to 2003 for my master's project was a ridiculously long master's. It's 4 years, but it was worth it. I collected bees in a place called Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which is in the Colorado Plateau. You can see in that little map in the upper right there, the darkly shaded area is kind of where it is. And I collected in a series of those standardized plots. We had 48 of them sort of scattered all over wherever we could really get to. Some of that area in the center under the word Kaiparowitz Plateau is just about impossible to get through for me, haha. But we set up these plots and collected bees, and we ended up with, over 4 years, over 2 million acres, about 80,000 individuals, which isn't as many as you would think. What does it amount to? Something like 1 bee for every 2 acres per year. So not too bad. And we collected for a total across those 4 years of 1,632 days. We managed to get quite a few of our species in plots, which is good because that allows us to go back and monitor populations for those 71% of the bees in plots. And overall, we found 660 species, 49 of which were undescribed. They are new species to science, which is always very fun. And here's one of the interesting things that I found. So bees are highly variable in abundance from year to year. So even in areas like Grand Staircase where there's no disturbance, there's no human activity, it's not being like transformed into hotels or anything, it's pretty much left alone and hasn't changed much in the last 20 years. But even across the 4 years that I was there, bee populations for any given species, and I just picked out 4 in one plot. So this is for a 1 hectare plot that I sampled. Andrina evoluta goes from 38 individuals 1 year in that plot to 12 or 11 the next year, and then back up and then back down. Meanwhile, in that same plot, Melisodes rustica is doing sort of the opposite thing. And at the same time, Halictus tripartitus, which is this one, is the scale was so different. I put it on its own graph here. 1 year we had 300 individuals, and the next year we had 50, and then it's on its way back up again. And this might have something to do with bet-hedging, but it could also be that the bees just naturally sort of move across the landscape and they come and go and ebb and flow from different areas. Even looking at the same bee, so this is Ceratina nanula, a really common, very abundant species throughout the monument, and looking across 4 years at 2 different plots. So this plot was called 21A99, and it's in blue, and in orange 86B98 is this one, and you can see that the same species, Ceratina nanula, is doing very different things in those 2 plots across 4 years. So point being, bees tend to be very variable from year to year. So I had the opportunity to go back and resample some of this in 2019. So 15, almost 20 years after I started the study, I got to go back. And what was really cool is that I could pick which plots I wanted to go to. So I picked 12 that were fairly abundant and that I had collected pretty consistently. And in a week of collecting at the beginning of June of last year, I got about 725 individuals and 83 species. And this is the best part. So the number of species in a plot has not changed significantly in any of those plots that I sampled over time. So let me explain this here. In blue is the average number of bees collected across 2000 to 2003, average number of species. And you'll notice in 2019 that we got, I think it was 16, but that's well within the range of what we found. This is a standard deviation bar across the 4 years that we sampled, with the top of the blue bar being the average. So things haven't really changed. We're kind of about where we were 20 years ago in these plots. But when I go to look more closely at who the members of those communities are, I'm finding that while the number of bees in a plot hasn't changed significantly over time, who those species are appears to have changed dramatically. So again, this is just to sort of illustrate, this isn't exact species, but let's assume that I found 3 species in a plot and they look like this. When I went back in 2019, I also found 3, but only one of those bees was in common between the 2 years, this one here in the middle. So the members of a community seem to very naturally change from year to year, even though on the whole, the species richness seems to be holding constant. So kind of fascinating, and it keeps me going. This is kind of why I love what I do and why I keep at it. There just seems to be constantly new questions to answer, new variables to kind of consider, and a lot of work to be done to kind of fill in those gaps that T.D.A. Cockrell was talking about 114 years ago. I think I left enough time, hopefully, for some questions. I'm trying to pull up so I can see the chat here and maybe we can answer some. Maybe. I should point out here that if any of you at any point are interested in reaching out to me, maybe asking questions that you don't get a chance to answer tonight, I would be more than happy to answer your questions. You can email me, you can read some of the few things we've written on our blog, or you can follow us on one of those social media sites. We have posts fairly regularly about different kinds of bees. Okay, so I'm looking at the questions here and I see one that says, what is the advantage of producing the first group of daughters? I don't know what the advantage is. So it's definitely just a different strategy for growing a colony to size, right? So, I mean, one way that you can create reproductive offspring by the end of the year is to just lay a whole bunch of eggs and call it good. But bumblebees go the social route, and maybe it gives them some advantage at the end of the year. Maybe there's 30 queens that are produced instead of just the 12 or 15 or whatever that your average bee would produce. So maybe the advantage is that more reproductive offspring are produced by the end of the year. I hope I answered that question right. That one's a little tricky for me, but let me know if I didn't and I'll try again.
Hi, Olivia. This is Lincoln.
Yeah.
I'll moderate some of these Q&As for you if you can't see them.
Okay.
So first we have from Elizabeth. What about the legs that allows them to detect electromagnetic forces?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how this works, except that I know it has to do with the legs, and it has to do with the fact that as the bee flies through the air, it has to do with the hairs that are on the legs, and as the bee flies through the air, it develops I believe it's a negative charge, and then the pollen has a positive charge, and so as they approach a plant, they can sense the presence of pollen in a way that you and I absolutely cannot. And I think the legs are the first thing to sort of experience that pull, but I think probably hairs on the rest of the body do as well.
Cool. From Andrea, where are mason bees native to?
Mason bees can be found, they're pretty widespread. So you can find mason bees, referring to the genus Osmia here, all throughout North America, a little bit into Mexico, but not very much, all throughout Europe, across Russia, China, Japan. I think they drop out, and there may be just a couple that are in the Southern Hemisphere, but not very many at all. So they're mostly a Northern Hemisphere group, but they've been around long enough that they're on all those continents naturally.
Cool. Let's see, from Elizabeth, do male bees specialize to which plants they sleep on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think if I've ever noticed a preference. I don't think so. I mean, so I've definitely noticed that, like, I see specialist mallow bees more commonly sleeping in mallow flowers, but they're also flying around them more during the day, and it may just be a part of their established turf, and they just have an area that they inhabit, and it has more to do with that than the actual flower that they end up sleeping in. Because they'll also sleep in, like, the cultivars that are in the area too that might have a similar sort of shape to them that they couldn't specialize on because it's not the native host to the female. So I would say in general, no, but they definitely have areas that they hang out in and don't really leave.
Cool. From Andre, how does climate change affect desert bees? Does diapause become affected with high temperature pulses?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And there's a lot of research ongoing right now trying to answer this. The short answer was we don't really have any answers yet, except to say that in desert mountain ranges where climate change has been more noticeable at high elevations, there has been evidence to show that bees and flowers are becoming less in sync than they used to be. So either the bee or the flower blooms at the wrong time. I will say that sort of my own hypothesis on this is that I wouldn't be surprised if bees have experienced climate change before. And any good bee that wants to hang around for a while is going to specialize on a plant that is widespread, super abundant with lots of blossoms, that's fairly predictable from year to year. And one of the things that we notice a lot with our specialist bees in particular is that that's where we find them. Specialist bees are on weedy plants like cactus, which blooms for months on end, and it's really hard to become out of sync with it. Creosote, same sort of thing, just a really long bloom. Unless there's a hard freeze, it's actually the hard freeze that gets the creosote. Globe mallow, sunflowers, all of these things tend to be a little less sensitive to climate change than other things. And I wonder if that's not a smart strategy on the part of a specialist over time to be on those.
Great. Let's see, from Ray, why is bee diversity so high in the desert Southwest?
Yes, we would all love to know the answer to this. There are all these hypotheses floating around, and they all, to me, sound plausible, but which one is the truth, I don't know. And chances are good they all have some, bit of the truth, and it probably has to do with which group of bees we're talking about. So here are a few of the hypotheses that are talked about. Number one, deserts. So we do find, and I should have followed up on this earlier when I was talking, but in general, we find a higher proportion of bees in deserts are ground nesters, whereas if you go back east, a higher proportion of bees are twig nesters. And the thought is that nesting in the ground in a deciduous temperate forest of some kind like that, the soil is going to be wetter, and there's a chance that the risk of infection from a mold or a mildew or some other pathogen is much higher there than in the soils here. So perhaps the amazing nesting resource for our ground nesting bees has allowed them to proliferate more here. There's also a much longer bloom time here. And within that bloom time, we have a lot of niches, right? So flowers are blooming from February through October, but they change so frequently that there's actually quite a few niches for different groups of bees to sort of exist across the season. Whereas if you go back east, you often find, for example, echinacea or something like that blooming for a really long period of time and not much turnover in the floral resources. And then the final thing is there's some thought that perhaps the pulsing of floral resources that happens in the desert can lead to isolation between groups of plants. So one year they're really connected, and then the next year things become isolated because it's so dry that, all the flowers aren't blooming, and the bees can go through a speciation event, and when they come back together during the next wet period, they're now separate species. But these are all hypotheses, and we don't really know in any case which one is the truth.
Wow. Okay. Next question from James. Could a Diadasia bituberculata female dig and provision more than one tunnel nest?
Yes. So depending on maybe the whims of the mother, maybe her personal preference, but maybe also something to do with the nesting substrate that they're in. Some bees will just have one nest entrance and put a whole bunch of little chambers off the end of it. But others will have one tunnel and put a couple in there, and then dig another tunnel and put a couple more little chambers with the egg and a nest provision in another, and move on more quickly to new nest cells.
Great.
Nest tunnels.
Let's see, from Patty, what percentage of solitary native bees are not able to mate, like workers of honeybees?
So I'm making sure, to my knowledge, and maybe there's some weird bee that I'm not thinking of, but to my knowledge, all female solitary bees are capable of mating. So there's no instances of worker honeybees. I think, Link, maybe can correct me here. I think even bumblebees, right? Aren't they?
I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot of possibilities with some of the more native social and semi-social species, and a lot of things we don't know.
Right, and I think they can even, if the queen were to die or something, I think that one of the worker bumblebees could take over. So I think the honeybee, that worker honeybee, is kind of the exception rather than the rule. On the other hand, there's that Perdita, the Macrotera, it's been renamed Macrotera portalis that's down in just above Mexico, the one that I highlighted for Bet-hedging. Has a really interesting thing where with the males, there's actually two morphs, so two different ways that the males can look, and one of them reproduces and the other just has a big head and hangs out in the nest and defends the nests of its sisters from everybody else. So kind of a strange, maybe the equivalent of a worker bee, but in the male system.
Crazy.
Yeah, very.
So let's see, from Michael, have all of the new species you found been described and named?
No, not even close. Although, so Anthophora pueblo, specimens that we collected in Grand Staircase contributed to the naming of that one. I think 2 or 3 of them have, but the vast majority have not. So the problem is, and maybe you all know this, I'm not sure how much knowledge is among the participants tonight, so I'm sorry if I'm saying something you all know, but the issue with naming a bee is that in order to do it, let's say it's a nomada, a kind of cuckoo bee. The key to them is kind of rough for the West, so a lot of the species in there haven't been named because they were discovered after the key was written and no one's rewritten it. So in order to name a new species, you need to gather all of the nomada that might be similar to it and look and make sure that it doesn't actually already have a name. And after you've looked at everything, then you go through and describe each and every body part in great detail and publish that. And usually people wait and try and do like all of the nomada at once or all of the hoplites rather than do it piecemeal with one species and then another. And that's why so many species end up unnamed for so long.
Mm-hmm. It's a huge undertaking.
Yes.
So a question here from Judy. When you say a bee specializes on a certain flower, does that mean the pollen and or nectar are the only food source that the larvae can eat, but that the adult female can eat pollen and nectar from a variety of plants?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. So generally speaking, the offspring eat, the majority of what they eat is pollen. And depending on which species it is, there may be more or less nectar mixed in. Sometimes it's really, really dry, and sometimes it's kind of soupy. And the egg actually just kind of floats on top of this nectary soup with some pollen sprinkled in. So species specific in that case, but that is their food source, and that's pretty much all they need. I talked about the centrus. A few of them will mix in some floral oils, but that's more of an exception than the rule for bees. The female mostly gathers, so this is why we have to be careful with figuring out, I don't know how many of you have looked at Discover Life, but if you scroll to the bottom of any species page, it'll list all of the plants that a bee's been collected on. And you can take a bee that we know to be a specialist and all that she's feeding to her offspring is like cactus pollen, but the adult female has been collected on 20 different plants, including sunflowers and all of these different things. But what we find is that the majority of the time that she's been observed, it's been on the host plant, the plant that she's collecting pollen from to feed to her offspring. But yeah, they definitely get nectar and a little pollen. The adults don't really eat a whole lot of pollen, just a little bit right when they emerge to stimulate ovulation. But after that, they mostly just live on nectar.
Great. The next question is from Kip. What was the species that nests in cacti stems? Also, do they create those holes themselves or use pre-existing ones?
So my friend Laurelyn took that picture. She was trying to study those in the Mojave Desert in order to answer questions about climate change. She wanted to look at how temperature changed, how quickly the bees developed. But while she was out there, she observed it was a Ashmediella, a little tiny Ashmediella, and I'm not sure what the common name for Ashmediella is. Small mason bee, maybe? And I believe it chewed its own hole in there. Wow. My guess is there was probably some injury already to the plant at that spot, which made it a little weaker, but she watched it kind of chomp at the edges and make it bigger.
Great. The next question is from Marika. Can you share some examples of bee species that you've met that emerge in the fall?
Sure. So really common ones that come out in the fall include the longhorned bees, Melisodes, and they fly pretty late too. They're one of the last ones you see before a freeze comes. Triepiolus, which is a parasite on the Melisodes, you'll find flying around the same time. There's a whole suite of mining bees. We think of mining bees as being spring bees, but there's actually a whole separate group that comes out in the fall and are quite prolific and easily found. And then Perdita, the good majority of the Perdita, those tiny, what do we call them, small mining bees or fairy bees, are also out kind of like mid-August all the way through September and into early October. And then one final one that I can think of is the cellophane bees, the Coletes. There's a whole bunch of those that come out in the fall, and many of them are specialists on some of those late summer asters that come out.
That's awesome. We'll send Marika on a late season bee hunt.
She can come stay here if she wants.
Let's see. Another question is from Ross. Looking at your maps of genera and species diversity, why does Texas have 200 fewer species than adjacent New Mexico when it shares many similar habitats?
Right. So half of Texas actually does show pretty similar habitats, but Texas also has the, I just forgot the name across the top. The Panhandle has a name, but it's a shortgrass prairie, and it's pretty understudied. So chances are there's some interesting stuff there that hasn't been reported on. But then as you head to East Texas, you end up in this kind of strangely humid, semi-treeless area that just doesn't seem to be very rich for bees compared to good portions of New Mexico. My guess would be it has something to do with soils and the floral resources. It's like sort of a no man's land between true eastern deciduous sort of forests and true western. And I think it's because only half of the state is really similar to what we find in New Mexico. So in that sense, it's a little smaller than you might think. Also, you know, there's more work to be done there. Chances are there's bees still to be discovered in Texas that are going to add to it, and that number should probably be higher.
Absolutely. Well, that's the end of our questions. That was a fantastic presentation, Olivia. Thank you so much. If you're interested in joining the Oregon Bee Atlas to help document the Oregon bee fauna and become a master melitologist, someone who studies wild bees. You can find information on our OregonBeeAtlas.org website and by following the Master Melittologist link. Projects like the Oregon Bee Atlas are supported by grants and especially by donations. So please consider giving a gift of any size to the Oregon Bee Atlas using our donation button on the website or contact us for directed contributions. Now, when you leave, you'll be prompted to complete a short survey. It will take you 1 minute. So please fill that out. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, and what you'd like to hear about in the future. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in August.